My husband canceled my dream trip to Paris because he said I hadn't earned it. What he didn't know was that I already owned the plane. When the pilot greeted me as Madam Owner, his jaw nearly hit the runway. This is the story of how I went from dismissed wife to private jet mogul, and why he'll never fly with me again. I had imagined the moment 1,000 times. Me, at the gate, passport in hand, wearing the silk scarf he brought me back from Tokyo. Hair tied low, understated earrings, a leather tote with just a single book inside. The kind of quiet luxury you don't need to explain. Paris in spring. It had always been my dream. He knew that. He used to say he loved that about me. Said it made me feel old-world elegant, like I belonged in some forgotten photograph from the golden age of travel. But now I stood alone at Terminal D, blinking through the announcement that my reservation had been canceled. I laughed at first. Actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was impossible. That can't be right, I said to the gate attendant, whose expression had already shifted into the smooth, practiced mask of corporate empathy. I'm sorry, Mrs. Caldwell, she repeated, eyes flicking toward the screen. The ticket was revoked early this morning by the original purchaser. There's a note here. It says, schedule change. That's when I saw him. My husband, Colin, standing 30 feet away in the lounge, watching me, not even hiding, just standing there, coffee in hand, wearing the gray jacket I had custom-tailored for him before his last Berlin meeting. He took a slow sip and raised his eyebrows like someone watching a poker hand play out exactly as expected. Did you do this? I asked, voice trembling as I approached him. He didn't answer, just glanced at his watch. Colin, I said again, louder this time. Did you cancel my ticket? He finally sighed. You're overreacting. I'm what? You've been saying for months you needed more time for reflection. Space to figure things out. Well, Paris would just complicate that. You promised. I know, he said, brushing invisible lint off his sleeve. But promises aren't contracts. I felt the words lodge in my throat like stones. This was our anniversary. He looked past me toward the gate, already boarding business class. Don't make a scene, he said, lowering his voice. You'll only prove my point. And then, like it was nothing, he turned and walked toward the jet bridge, handing his boarding pass to the attendant without another glance. I stood there, shaking, watching the back of the man I married disappear down the tunnel of privilege and cruelty. The worst part wasn't the ticket cancellation. It was the knowledge that he'd planned it. That sometime between pretending to be busy at dinner and rescheduling our couple's therapy, he'd found the time to sabotage my one joy, not out of malice, but out of control, power. That quiet, suffocating kind of control dressed in tailored suits and justifications. I sat near the gate in stunned silence, hands frozen around my tote straps. The scarf, the one he bought me in Tokyo, felt like a joke now, a prop, one more accessory in the performance he needed me to play. The PA crackled above me. Final call for Flight 203 to Charles de Gaulle. Somewhere in that plane, he was sipping champagne, legs stretched in 1A, probably texting his assistant/affair, Genevieve. I'd seen the way she looked at him in meetings, sharp, reverent, calculated. He thought he was subtle. He thought I was blind. But what he didn't know, what he could never imagine, was that he wasn't the only one with secrets. I checked my phone. A message blinked from Rhodes, private ops. Jet is fueled and ready. Your manifest is cleared. We await your instruction, Madam Owner. Madam Owner. I stared at those words. Let them sit on my tongue like wine too rich to drink. He canceled a trip, but I owned the plane, and soon he'd know what it felt like to be grounded. The airport lounge emptied slowly, like a theater after a brutal final act. I sat alone at a corner table, untouched cappuccino gone cold beside me, my reflection warping in the darkened window overlooking the tarmac. His flight was long gone now, the Paris skyline rising in his imagination, while I remained here in silence, as if some invisible tether kept me from lifting off. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that I had never needed his ticket, only his permission, and now that too was irrelevant. I scrolled back through the last text from Rhodes. The message was still there, waiting like an open door. Awaiting your instruction, Madam Owner. I didn't respond. Not yet. Not because I wasn't ready to fly, but because I wanted him to arrive in Paris thinking he had won. Let him order oysters on the company card. Let him check into the suite he insisted on upgrading to for optics. Let him rehearse whatever version of our marriage he planned to recite to Genevieve, between martinis and meetings. I wanted him to believe, with full confidence, that he had clipped my wings. He didn't know how wrong he was. Back home, the penthouse was museum quiet, designed to impress, never to comfort. Every surface cold, polished, every piece of furniture chosen by his designer to match a brand, a lifestyle, an ambition. The space reflected him more than us, and it always had. I kicked off my shoes at the entryway and walked barefoot across the marble floor, still chilled from the morning storm. I passed the wine fridge I wasn't allowed to stock, the piano I wasn't allowed to touch, the thermostat I wasn't allowed to change because of energy optimization. My whole life had been quietly optimized into irrelevance. Colin believed he ran the show. Finances, schedules, investments, even our social calendar. But beneath his empire of spreadsheets and performance metrics, I had built something else entirely, quietly, carefully, in the seams of our marriage, hidden beneath maiden names and holding companies and trust structures even his forensic accountants wouldn't find. It hadn't started as revenge. It started as survival. I met Colin when I was 24, working as a systems analyst for a regional airline. He had just made partner at his firm, all charisma and cufflinks, sweeping into the room like he already owned the airspace. He loved to talk about business class, about vertical control, and top-down dominance. Even then, the metaphors should have warned me, but I was young, hungry for momentum, and he knew exactly how to stage affection as mentorship. He funded my MBA, suggested I drop my last name, Menon, because it was hard for Boston society to pronounce. Told me we were a team, a brand. Said, Marin Caldwell sounded clean, powerful, editorial. I didn't know I'd disappear inside it, but something stayed with me. My father's name, the one I'd never truly let go of, Menon. It remained the legal entity under which I quietly registered Menon Aero Holdings, months before our 3rd anniversary. I started with minor charters, pilots I met at my former airline who were burnt out, brilliant, and underpaid, aircrafts that were aging but airworthy. I hired an attorney my husband didn't know, funded through an inheritance he didn't ask about, and let the company operate from a digital shell with no mention of me. For 2 years, it grew in silence. Then, one evening, Colin came home from a dinner with venture partners buzzing about a new executive jet company disrupting the Northeast charter market. Menon Aero, he said aloud. We should look into that. I nodded from across the kitchen island, slicing limes for his Negroni, careful not to flinch. He was already circling my orbit and didn't even know it. But today, the Paris incident, it changed everything. No more waiting. No more hidden altitudes. He had canceled a dream just to prove he could. And the only thing more dangerous than a man who thought he had control was a woman who had quietly reclaimed it. I sat down at the edge of the bed, opened my laptop, and logged into the command interface of Menon Aero's charter system. The tail number of the Gulfstream G650 was already filed for Paris. The crew manifest was confirmed. The fuel report was green. I tapped out a single message to Rhodes. Departure confirmed. 8 a.m. sharp tomorrow. Discretion advised. We'll be joined by a guest. I didn't know yet who that guest would be. Maybe my best friend Dara, who once joked she'd sell her soul to sip espresso on the Seine. Maybe no one at all. Maybe I'd stretch across 6 leather seats, sipping champagne alone, free from his shadows and expectations. The point wasn't who came with me. The point was that I was going. And next time Colin tried to cancel my flight, he'd learn the only name on the manifest that mattered was mine. Before I could own a jet, I had to own a memory. That's what I reminded myself the next morning as I sipped coffee on the balcony, wrapped in the wool cardigan Colin once called provincial. The Boston skyline glimmered through the early fog, 1,000 tiny windows catching light, a city full of men like him, building castles on paper and mistaking them for kingdoms. I wasn't always like this. Polished, precise, performed. I used to smell like engine grease. My earliest memories weren't of storybooks or ballet recitals. They were of hangars, of oil-streaked notebooks and roaring engines, of standing on a step stool beside my father while he adjusted the hydraulics on a Cessna 172, showing me how the flaps worked. Pressure tells the truth, he used to say. Listen to what the metal says under strain. It never lies. My dad, Rajan Menon, was a line mechanic for a tiny airstrip in New Hampshire. He made $42,000 a year and never once complained. He could coax life back into aircraft others called retired, could identify engine problems by sound alone. He believed in discipline, not dollars. When he wasn't fixing planes, He was teaching me to read aircraft manuals instead of fairy tales. My mother, Sarita, was different. All polish and poise. A flight attendant who'd started in the 80s when glamour still clung to the job. She spoke 5 languages and taught me how to keep my back straight, even when turbulence hit. She knew how to smile through first-class tantrums and deliver safety instructions with the elegance of a diplomat. Together, they were flight and frame. When I was 11, my father was laid off. The airline went under. We lost the house a year later. That was the first time I heard the word leverage used like a weapon. The bank took everything except a box of my dad's tools and a stack of unpaid flight school brochures with my name written on top. My mother got us an apartment over a deli, and I started tutoring rich kids in math after school. I never stopped working after that. Not in college, not in grad school, not even after I married Colin and he insisted I slow down. A phrase that meant nothing to someone raised by people who never had the luxury of resting. He called it ambition. I called it inheritance. The day after he canceled my Paris trip, I drove to the airfield alone. Not the corporate terminal where his firm sent executives, but the private hangar I'd quietly purchased last year under Menon Aero's third holding company. It sat on a disused stretch of tarmac, surrounded by rusted fencing and frostbitten weeds. No one suspected power hid here. The Gulfstream G650 was waiting, its nose pointed east. The sun was still low, casting the fuselage in bronze. Captain Rhodes stood beside the stairs, clipboard in hand. Leather jacket zipped against the morning chill. "Dr. Menon," he greeted me. That name again. Mine. The one I'd buried to make my marriage look cleaner. The one Colin had mocked gently, casually, said it sounded too regional for Harvard clubs and too ethnic for company dinners. He didn't know it was the name I used to buy jets under his nose. I nodded. "All systems? Pre-flight's complete. Co-pilot's inside running final diagnostics. Weather looks smooth. You'll be in Paris by dinner." I looked at the aircraft and felt the ghost of my father's hands guiding my shoulders. Listen to the pressure. Trust what it's telling you. I climbed the stairs and entered the cabin. Cream leather, mahogany trim, smart glass windows, the scent of aviation-grade polish and opportunity, every detail carefully chosen, but not by Colin's designers, by me. These weren't symbols of wealth, they were tools of escape. I had no desire to be envied, only underestimated. I settled into the main seat, plugged in my tablet, and reviewed the flight log. There were no company logos, no social tags. This was a ghost fleet by design. Anonymous, elegant, untouchable. By the time we took off, the sun had fully crested. As we climbed above the clouds, Boston disappeared beneath a silver sheet, and I felt a deep, steady calm spread through my chest. Not peace, not yet, but control. For once, no one could cancel this trip but me. And somewhere over the Atlantic, I realized this wasn't just about Paris. It was about airspace, my own invisible domain. Colin had mastered the boardroom, but I had mastered the sky. The first jet I ever bought was older than my marriage, a Gulfstream G200 with fading paint and outdated avionics, but clean logs, impeccable maintenance, and one owner who was desperate to offload it fast, a widow named Lorraine, who had no interest in fighting her late husband's partners over asset valuation. This plane was his mistress, she told me bluntly over black coffee in a hangar office that smelled of dust and old jet fuel. I just wanted out of my life. I didn't flinch. I didn't haggle. I nodded once, quietly slid over the pre-agreed transfer documents, and offered condolences that weren't rehearsed. Lorraine studied my face, the brown eyes, the steady posture, the lack of pretense. Then she signed, like she was cutting a cord that had strangled her for years. That was 2 years ago. And it was the moment Menon Aero went from a theory in my head to a fleet in progress. Back then, I was still pretending to be Colin's passive wife, attending the right benefits, wearing the right brands, laughing at the right times. My LinkedIn profile still listed me as a strategic partner at his consulting firm, a euphemism for unpaid branding puppet. He liked that I could write grants and decode investor decks, but didn't like when I had opinions in the room. "You're brilliant," he once told me, tapping my temple affectionately. "But don't lead with it. It intimidates the people who sign checks." He meant the men. He always meant the men. So I built Menon Aero in the background like a second heartbeat. Quiet, rhythmic, essential. Lorraine's plane was stored in a modest hangar in upstate New York. It had been grounded for over a year, pending legal battles she was too tired to fight. I hired a corporate attorney, Margaret Alonquo, through a shell firm registered in Delaware. Margaret specialized in asset separation, wealth protection, and confidential ownership structures. No questions, only outcomes. You understand, she said after our first meeting, that your husband will never see your name on any of these documents. I'm counting on that, I replied. We structured the holding in layers. Menon Aero Holdings was the parent, but beneath it were 3 shell subsidiaries: Indigo Vector Logistics, Crosswave Air Partners, and Synthesis Sky. Each company owned 1 aircraft, each registered in a different jurisdiction with 0 overlap in tax exposure. My name appeared nowhere, but my signature was on every operating agreement, as the trustee of the Menon Legacy Trust, funded discreetly by my maternal grandmother before she passed. That $180,000 inheritance had sat dormant for years, parked in a conservative bond ladder, waiting. When I told Colin it had been used to pay down my student debt, he nodded approvingly. Smart, he said. Debt is cancer. The only cancer was his control. With Lorraine's G200 as my base, I began building a network, leasing her aircraft to C-suite executives from biotech firms who needed fast, confidential travel between Boston, D.C., and Toronto. No baggage limits, no TSA, no paparazzi, and best of all, no trail. By the end of year 1, the plane had paid for itself. I reinvested the profits, acquired a Citation Latitude through a distressed asset sale in Florida, then a Phenom 300 in Arizona from a CEO mid-divorce who couldn't afford to look like he was bleeding. Every transaction was designed to look like someone else's move. While Colin played status games at his firm, pretending to mentor young analysts, grinning through merger dinners, shaking hands with senators like he was one of them, I was quietly building a skyward empire, and he never asked. Never once in our 5 years did he question the late-night texts, the sudden business trips, the side accounts I kept for consulting. To him, I was busy with passion projects, harmless and unimpressive, science-adjacent, grounded. He saw me as a woman who understood jet engines but never imagined I'd buy the whole damn fleet. One night, he returned from a partner retreat in Napa, drunk on Pinot Noir and backroom power plays. I was reviewing flight logs on my tablet, barely blinking. He leaned over my shoulder and laughed. Still playing air traffic controller? I smiled, still pretending to rule the world. He kissed my forehead and stumbled to bed. I stared at his retreating figure and thought, one of us is pretending. The other is ascending. The hangar I bought for Lorraine's jet became my new HQ. Modest, old school, nothing flashy. The kind of place no one would look twice at. But inside, fiber optic connections, digital walls, an encrypted server farm controlling a growing empire of leased jets, staggered crew rotations, and NDAs tighter than the seals on my Gulfstream's fuel tanks. When clients asked to meet the owner, I declined politely. Discretion is our policy, I'd say. You're not flying with a brand. You're flying with silence. And yet, that silence grew louder. By the time Colin canceled my Paris flight, my fleet was moving 12 executive teams a week. Helix Dynamics had just signed a monthly contract for biotech liaison flights, and one of those manifests, the one he didn't review closely, had his name on it, Colin Caldwell, flying to Paris, on a plane owned by the woman he tried to keep grounded. And soon, he'd learn that altitude wasn't about elevation, it was about perspective. I didn't need to be seen. I only needed to be above him. There is a particular kind of smile a man wears when he believes he's the smartest person in the room. Confident, practiced, devoid of curiosity. Colin wore it often. But that night at the Boston Equity Gala, the smile became something more, a mask of dominance. He stood on stage, whiskey in hand, tuxedo tailored to an inch of vanity, giving a speech about emerging markets and bold leadership. He gestured toward the future like he had a stake in it. I watched from a table near the back, the one reserved for significant others, seated next to a woman who'd been described in the program as partner adjacent. They never said wives. That term carried the risk of permanence. The gala was held in the Ritz ballroom, all chandeliers and soft jazz and men who wore ambition like cologne. The theme this year was vision in flight, a metaphor that nearly made me choke. Paper plane centerpieces, murals of clouds and runways, even a fog machine for dramatic effect as donors walked through the entry archway. Colin didn't see the irony. Why would he? To him, flight was metaphor. To me, it was memory, bone, bloodline. When the speeches ended, he returned to our table with his usual fanfare, drawing attention like gravity. His colleagues laughed at his jokes with a slight delay, each waiting to see how the others would respond first. Genevieve was there, too, of course, sitting one table closer to the stage than me, in a red sheath dress 2 inches too tight and 4 inches too strategic. Her laugh rose above the others, high and sharp, like a knife clinking against crystal. At dinner, Colin leaned over and said, "You're quiet tonight." I smiled politely, just enjoying the altitude. He smirked at the pun, not realizing I meant the irony of watching a man brag beneath a ceiling I was already flying above. Then came the moment. Marcus, one of the senior partners, raised his glass and said, "To the Caldwells, the smartest man in the room and the most patient woman I've ever met." Laughter rippled. Colin stood slightly, bowed with faux humility, and looked at me. "Patience is her best virtue, especially when I go on about mergers over breakfast." More laughter. Then, the final twist of the knife, he gestured toward me and said, "She's got her own interests. Something with aircrafts and engines. What is it again, darling? Jet hobbyist? Fuel mechanic?" I blinked. His tone was playful, just enough charm to let him off the hook, just enough condescension to silence me. The table laughed again, this time less politely, more sincerely. Genevieve bit her lip as if holding back a real smile. I excused myself and walked to the edge of the ballroom, where the fake clouds were swirling under purple light. My hands trembled, but not with humiliation, with clarity. That moment, that joke, that smirk, that damn paper plane centerpiece, snapped something inside me into perfect focus. I didn't care about Paris anymore. Not really. Not the lost ticket or the canceled flight or the cheap power play. What I cared about now was the narrative, the one he'd stolen from me, the one where I was just a clever sidekick to his brilliant arc, the woman with potential who never quite arrived. But I had arrived. I had been flying for years, quietly, efficiently, legally. My aircraft were in the air while he sat here, talking about disruption as if he'd invented the word. Back at the table, Genevieve leaned toward him and whispered something. His laugh was too loud, the kind that demands attention, even as it exposes insecurity. I looked around the ballroom and realized something else. I wasn't invisible. I was unrecognized. They didn't know me, and that was the most powerful position I could hold. I didn't need them to see me rise. I needed them to feel me land. Later that night, as the valet brought around our car, Colin scrolled through emails with the casual detachment of a man certain the world belonged to him. "Tomorrow," he muttered. "I've got that client meeting with the Paris team. I might stay a few extra days. Networking, you understand." "I do," I replied, because I did. I understood everything now. His firm had booked the flight 3 days ago. I saw the manifest in my dashboard. A one-way charter from Boston to Le Bourget. Passengers: Colin Caldwell, Genevieve Ashford. No return flight logged yet. And the aircraft they booked? Mine. My Gulfstream G650. My registration code. My crew. My airspace. He would walk aboard thinking he was ascending, but soon he would find the altitude a bit colder than expected, and the owner of the sky watching from a seat he never reserved. The next morning, I confirmed the flight itinerary, and I made a call to Rhodes. "Captain," I said, "I'd like to update the welcome procedure. When Mr. Caldwell boards, please greet him as you would any VIP passenger. But when you see me, yes, Dr. Menon, make sure he hears you say it clearly. Madam Owner, there's a moment, just before a jet lifts off, when the cabin pressure shifts. A soft hum becomes a roar, and gravity begins to lose its grip. I've always loved that second, when possibility detaches from the runway. That's what I felt when I opened the manifest. It was a Thursday morning, barely past 7, and I was reviewing standard dispatch reports from Men & Arrow's operations interface, an old habit I'd never outgrown. Even with staff in place, I still checked routes, fuel loads, clearance flags. Control wasn't just power, it was peace. But this manifest stopped me. Tail number, N580MA aircraft, Gulfstream, G650 route, KBOS, LFPB, Boston Logan, Paris Le Bourget. Date, Saturday. Departure, 8 a.m. Passengers, Caldwell C. Ashford, G. Special request. Stocked crystal champagne, gluten-free options, discretion upon boarding. I sat perfectly still, blinking at the screen. Caldwell, C. Genevieve Ashford, my husband, his protege. and a flight scheduled for the city he'd once promised to take me to for our 5th anniversary, which he now intended to enjoy with her, aboard my aircraft. The irony wasn't poetic, it was surgical. He had booked the flight through a third-party concierge firm Men & Arrow contracted with, one of those elite travel outfits that cater to hedge funds and private equity sharks. He had no idea who operated the aircraft. No idea that I personally negotiated the lease agreement that gave Men & Arrow exclusive ownership rights to that tail number. No idea that when the pilot greeted them on the tarmac, the cabin they stepped into would belong to the woman he'd humiliated just days earlier. And no idea that I was flying the same route. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. So instead, I just breathed. Then, I leaned forward and tapped the intercom button on my private office desk. "Get me Rhodes." He answered 2 rings later, voice clipped, alert, already in uniform. "Yes, Dr. Menon? Flight 580 MA. The one scheduled for Saturday. Confirmed manifest?" "Yes, ma'am. Passenger list just came in this morning. Jet is prepped. Crew briefed. Will be wheels up at 0800 unless you give other instructions." I paused. "Do not reschedule, but I will be joining that flight." A beat of silence. "Understood. And Captain?" I added, my voice low, precise. "Make sure the cabin is spotless. And when they arrive, I want the guest protocol followed. But you greet me first. Use the title. Madam Owner," he said without missing a beat. As always, I ended the call and sat back, letting the silence settle. Colin believed he had orchestrated a triumphant escape, a luxurious getaway with the woman he hadn't yet admitted he was sleeping with, a chance to parade her through Paris, where no one from our Boston circle could witness the fallout. He thought he was clever, discreet. But the world is much smaller at 41,000 feet. There's no such thing as anonymity in my airspace. Later that day, I watched from my car as he left our building, rolling a monogrammed suitcase behind him. Genevieve trailed 3 steps behind, wearing sunglasses too large for the fading sun. They looked like a couple playing at espionage, except he was too self-absorbed, and she too ambitious to play it convincingly. I wondered what they would talk about on the flight. Markets? Deals? Or would she lean into his arm and coo about French wine and rooftop dinners? It didn't matter. I wouldn't hear their conversation, but they would hear mine, because this time, I wouldn't be invisible, not silent, not reduced to a footnote or a punchline. This time, when I walked toward the jet, in tailored silk and aviator shades, it would be me they noticed. Me, the captain saluted. Me, the crew bowed to. I didn't want drama. I didn't want confrontation. I didn't even want revenge in the conventional sense. I wanted the look in his eyes when he realized what I'd become while he was too busy dismissing me. The woman who wasn't just on the manifest, but who owned it, and every foot of sky above it. Friday evening, the Terminal Sky Lounge was empty, except for a concierge arranging macarons on mirrored trays, and a man 2 booths over murmuring into a phone about hedge fund exit strategies. Outside, the tarmac glowed under golden hour light, streaks of amber washing over the fuselage of a waiting Learjet. Every surface around me gleamed. Glass, brass, polished ambition. Colin would be here tomorrow morning, boarding a flight he didn't know I owned, with a woman he hadn't officially confessed to loving, but whom he guarded more protectively than any financial portfolio. It was the perfect place to tell the truth, not to him, to myself. I sat by the window, nursing a drink I didn't really want, flipping through legal documents on my tablet. The beginnings of a mutual release clause, drafted in silence over the past 2 days by the only person I trusted more than myself, Margaret Alonquo, my attorney. She had built her reputation dismantling high-net-worth marriages in a city where power masquerades as civility. Margaret didn't believe in justice. She believed in leverage, and she believed I had more of it than I realized. "I want it clean," I had told her over a secure call the day before. "No ongoing spousal support. No claims, no clause. You want a clean break?" she'd replied. "Or you want revenge disguised as detachment?" I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because I wasn't ready to name the shape of my anger. It had evolved into something cooler, more surgical. Revenge is noisy. What I wanted was quiet eradication, the kind that looks like indifference from the outside, the kind that ruins a man slowly, because it doesn't ruin you first. My fingers hovered over the clause. Mutual release from all present and future claims, including but not limited to assets acquired post-dissolution, intellectual property developed during marriage, or undisclosed financial holdings. The language was ironclad, the kind of clause that no man signs unless he's certain his wife is destitute, defeated, and unlikely to recover. Colin would sign it. He believed I had nothing, no income, no assets beyond the shared accounts he managed. He believed I'd fall apart without his structure, float away like a kite with no string. He had no idea I'd replaced every tether he ever gave me with one of my own design. He didn't know about Min and Arrow. He didn't know about the pending deal with the Swedish tech firm poised to acquire our proprietary scheduling algorithm. He didn't know that the same lawyer preparing our amicable exit was also negotiating final terms on a $42 million asset transfer that would never trace back to me, because it legally wasn't me. It was Maren Menon, a woman he erased on paper, but who had survived in shadows, and now moved aircraft above his head. I closed the tablet and sat back. The lights in the lounge dimmed as the sun dipped below the skyline. I watched runway lights flicker to life, little fireflies guiding aircraft home. I remembered the first time Colin had taken me to Paris. A layover, technically, but he called it our first adventure. We stayed in a hotel where the curtains were velvet, and the minibar cost more than our first month's rent. I'd been so enamored with the idea of travel then, so eager to feel like part of something large, romantic, cinematic. But now I knew. Romance is not about destinations. It's about recognition, respect, being seen without needing to shout. And Colin had never seen me. He saw only what I reflected. Status, intelligence, elegance, something to enhance his brand, never as a force of her own. Tomorrow he'd see it, not through confrontation, not through a fight, but through contrast. He'd walk toward the jet thinking he was entering neutral space, and find himself in the center of my domain. As I left the lounge that night, the concierge handed me a small white envelope. "This arrived earlier," she said, "from a courier. No return name." I opened it outside, wind brushing the hem of my coat. Inside was a card with only 4 words, scrawled in Colin's handwriting. "Paris will be different." I stared at it. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. The hangar was hushed at 7:41 a.m. On that kind of industrial silence reserved for moments before takeoff, engines quiet, checklist complete, air heavy with anticipation. The Gulfstream G650 gleamed beneath the hangar lights, its nose tilted slightly toward the open runway beyond. I stood just inside the shadows, watching the crew move in practiced precision. Captain Rhodes spotted me first. He didn't wave. That wasn't his style. He simply gave the barest nod, like a soldier acknowledging the general who'd already won the war. I stepped forward, heels echoing off concrete. As I neared the aircraft, the ground crew parted without instruction, like they instinctively understood who I was, who I had become. "Morning, Madam Owner," Rhodes said, as I approached the stairs. He stood tall in his dark aviator uniform, clipboard in one hand, headset dangling from his neck. "Cabin is pressurized. Catering is set. All clear on ATC. We're on schedule." "Thank you, Captain," I said, pausing before stepping onto the stairs. "Our guests?" "En route. Expected in 15. "Good. I didn't want to be on board yet. I wanted them to see me board." Rhodes hesitated, his gaze steady. "Do you want me to deliver the greeting exactly as discussed?" I turned to him. "Yes. Make sure he hears it." He gave a half smile. "Pleasure to execute." Inside the cabin, everything was as I had ordered. Cream leather polished to a matte finish. Gold accents subtle and modern. 2 seats angled just slightly toward the window with a view designed to impress. A tray of macarons sat neatly under a dome lid, next to a silver bucket chilling Cristal. The perfect scene for 2 people, celebrating a betrayal dressed as an upgrade. I set my tote beside the forward seat, adjusted the silk scarf around my neck, the same one Colin had canceled when he canceled the Paris trip. It felt poetic now, reclaiming something he once deemed frivolous. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the Menon Aero flight dashboard. Tail number N580OMA, boarding in 12 minutes. Destination, LFPB, Le Bourget, Paris. Owner, Maren Menon, via Menon Legacy Trust. Passengers, 3. The third was me. Of course, he didn't know that yet. I stepped back down the stairs and waited beneath the nose cone, letting the cold kiss my face, grounding myself in the moment. There was no anger left, no adrenaline, just calculation, just anticipation, the kind you feel before a presentation that will shift the trajectory of everything. And then they arrived. A black Escalade pulled onto the tarmac like a bullet dressed in chrome. The door opened, and Genevieve stepped out first, Red dress, high heels not suited for jet stairs, hair coiled tightly like she thought it made her look older, wiser. Then Colin. Sunglasses, leather weekender, that smug ease in his shoulders that always came before a pitch or a lie. He adjusted his collar, said something to Genevieve that made her smile tightly, and then he looked up and saw me. I didn't move, didn't smile, just stood beside the boarding stairs, like I'd been standing here forever, like I belonged here, because I did. He slowed but didn't stop, confusion shadowing his face. Genevieve's brows furrowed. She whispered something, but Colin ignored her. He kept walking until he was 10 feet away. Marin, the use of my name, my real name, was unintentional, an accident, but it broke through years of erasure. "Good morning," I said, voice level, gaze flat. He blinked. Why are you here?" That's when Rhodes stepped forward. "Madam Owner," he said, voice strong and clear, "your aircraft is ready for departure. Would you like to board now, or wait until your guests have settled?" Colin's expression cracked, just for a second. His eyes darted between me and Rhodes, and then to the tail number on the jet. His lips parted. No words came. Genevieve stepped forward. "Wait, what is this?" "Your flight to Paris," I replied. "On my plane." Yes." I didn't raise my voice. "It's been mine for 2 years." Colin exhaled a single stunned laugh. "This is some kind of, stunt? You're trying to humiliate me?" "No, Colin. I'm simply flying to Paris, like I planned." Rhodes stepped back with soldierly grace, and I turned, placing one foot on the bottom step of the staircase. "You canceled one trip," I said over my shoulder. "I bought the fleet, and then I ascended." Each step was deliberate, the wind tugging gently at my coat, my heels tapping like punctuation on a sentence I had written alone. At the top, I turned once more. Colin was still standing there, unmoving, watching, not with anger, not even with shame, but with the dawning horror of a man realizing he'd underestimated the wrong woman for far too long. I stepped inside and let the door seal behind me with a hiss that sounded like a closing chapter. From the moment the aircraft door sealed shut with that signature pneumatic hiss, the air inside the Gulf Stream shifted, not just in pressure, but in power. The cabin became something else entirely, a curated theater, and I was both director and lead. I didn't sit down immediately. Instead, I walked slowly through the aisle, fingers grazing the seatbacks, absorbing the silence. The pilots were finalizing pre-flight. The engines hadn't yet spooled. Rhodes knew to wait. Delay wasn't a mistake. It was part of the choreography. Outside, I knew they were still standing on the tarmac, trying to make sense of what just happened. Colin would be playing it off, at first, explaining it away to Genevieve, calling it a coincidence, a booking glitch, maybe even a marketing stunt from the charter company. He'd need to tell himself a story he could survive. But the longer they waited, the harder that story would be to sell. Control isn't always about moving quickly. Sometimes it's about making the other side wait, just long enough for doubt to settle like fog. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and sat near the forward cabin window. From this angle, I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. The tension in the air was precise, elegant, manufactured, like a string pulled tight, not to break, but to hum. I checked the onboard tablet. ETA, 6 hours, 47 minutes, weather over the Atlantic. Clear. In-flight connectivity, disabled per my instruction. Genevieve would hate that. She lived for her notifications. Her curated digital world was the oxygen she breathed. Colin, on the other hand, would see the blackout for what it was. A message. You don't get to document this. This was the opposite of Instagram. This was memory. Slow, sticky, unforgettable. At 8:13 a.m., the cabin door reopened. Rhodes stepped in, a quiet signal that they had finally boarded. I didn't rise to greet them. I remained seated, calm, my gaze resting out the window. The door sealed again, and this time, it stayed closed for good. Footsteps behind me. 2 sets. Slower than usual. Heavier. Hesitant. "Good morning," I said, without turning around. "Marin," Colin said, with the kind of cautious warmth that precedes a negotiation. "Let's talk." Genevieve stood behind him like a shadow that didn't know where to fall. She'd swapped her heels for flats, preparing for comfort, not combat. Her voice was taut. "Is this legal?" I smiled slightly. "You're flying on a plane legally leased by your firm's charter concierge, fully documented. Signed by your travel director. All paperwork valid. I simply own the vessel. Colin's eyes narrowed. You did this on purpose. No, I said, finally turning to face them. You did. You booked this flight. I just didn't stop you. Silence. The kind of silence where two people begin replaying every prior conversation, scanning for clues they missed. You could almost hear the gears grinding in their heads. I gestured toward the opposite seat. You can sit, or not. Doesn't matter to me. They sat. Genevieve glanced around, noticing the floral arrangement, a minimalist orchid I'd requested the day before. Her gaze caught the etched initials on the glassware. MM. It would haunt her later, that detail. We were already taxiing now. Rhodes had said nothing over the intercom. He knew. Let the tension do the speaking. The power wasn't in explaining. It was in witnessing. So this is a message, Colin finally said, folding his hands like he was moderating a panel. You've made your point. I looked at him. You think this is about a point? He faltered. Isn't it? No, I said softly. This is about position. Meaning? Meaning you spent our entire marriage sitting at the front of every room, every plane, every table. You thought I was lucky to sit next to you. You never asked whose seat it really was. Genevieve shifted, her discomfort now less about the setting and more about the subtext. She was realizing this wasn't just about jealousy or a canceled anniversary. This was something older, something built over years. Colin, I said, how many planes have you flown on this year? He shrugged. 8, maybe 10. I don't know. And how many of those were mine? He blinked. You see, I continued, you spent years thinking altitude was power, but power isn't in the seat. It's in the name on the invoice. You've been hiding money from me, he said suddenly, latching onto the only explanation he could understand. You concealed assets. No, I replied evenly. I separated them, just like you separated me from respect, from autonomy, from credibility. Genevieve stood. I'm not staying for this. I nodded toward the back of the jet. You're welcome to use the rear cabin. Doors close, fully soundproofed. Champagne's chilled. She hesitated, then walked quickly, heels tapping too hard on the floor, trying not to show retreat. Colin remained. You're making a mistake, he said, softer now. Less certainty, more fear. You think this makes you strong, but it makes you petty. No, I said, sipping my water. It makes me patient. We rose above the clouds just then. The turbulence smoothed, the light shifted. Everything became quieter, less heavy. You canceled my trip to Paris, I whispered, almost to myself, to control me. I turned my gaze back out the window. And now, I'm taking you with me. Not for company, not for comfort, but to show him what power looks like when it doesn't need to scream. Le Bourget Airport greeted us with cold light and crisp precision. Unlike Charles de Gaulle, it wasn't built for the wandering masses. It was for those who moved through the world like owners, not visitors. The runway stretched into a gray horizon, dusted with early spring frost, and the terminal stood like a glass jewel box, minimalist and imposing. We descended the aircraft stairs in silence. Genevieve had not emerged from the rear cabin until we landed. Her face, once polished into confidence, had the taut look of someone whose narrative was slipping through her hands. She adjusted her sunglasses too often, carried her designer handbag like a shield. Colin, however, had entered a new mode, one I recognized well: damage control. He was already back in negotiation posture, charming, rational, pretending to be the reasonable man who just needed clarity. He hadn't yet realized that the leverage he assumed he had no longer existed. A black town car waited on the tarmac. My driver, the same one he'd once told me was an unnecessary extravagance when I'd floated the idea of hiring a Paris-based assistant years ago. Funny how necessity shifts with power. Where are you staying? He asked as I slid into the car. Left Bank, Art District. I have meetings. He blinked. Meetings? Yes, I said. Not everything is personal, Colin. He nodded, pretending he understood. Even as his mind raced to fill in the blanks, he would ask himself, was this revenge? Was it performance? Or was it freedom? He wouldn't be able to answer. Not yet. I didn't tell him that I had dinner scheduled with the CEO of the Nordic biotech firm interested in acquiring Menen Aero's data logistics IP, or that the French aviation magazine Altitude Femme had asked for an interview about women disrupting private air mobility, or that I planned to visit the hangar where Lorraine's first aircraft, the one that started all of this, was being retrofitted for transcontinental efficiency. He didn't deserve that story. that story was mine. The hotel suite overlooked Rue Saint-André-des-Arts, a narrow, poetic stretch of Paris that smelled like old books and fresh espresso. My room had floor-to-ceiling windows, a writing desk, and a vase of irises I hadn't requested. There was no gold, no marble, no performance of luxury, just quiet, intentional comfort, the kind I used to beg Colin to understand. I changed into flats, wrapped a linen scarf around my shoulders, and walked along the Seine. The city hummed softly around me, indifferent and elegant. I passed a street vendor selling old aviation prints. One caught my eye, a 1940s French air service poster, pale blue with a single-engine plane rising above the Alps. I bought it, for €20 and a memory. That night, at dinner, the restaurant was dimly lit and lined with mahogany shelves. The CEO, Ingrid Sahlström, arrived precisely at 8 p.m., wearing no makeup and a suit that didn't try too hard. I liked her immediately. She got straight to the point. "We want your predictive scheduling algorithm," she said, not even glancing at the menu. "We're prepared to offer equity plus royalties, but we'd prefer full acquisition. And if I say no," she smiled, "then we watch Men and Arrow become our next competitor. Either way, you win." I paused, thinking of Colin, of how he used to phrase things as if I were lucky to be considered, how every compliment was a leash, how every opportunity was filtered through his comfort. But this was clean. I leaned forward, folded my napkin beside my wine glass. "Make me your best offer. No games." She nodded. "You'll have it in 48 hours. Back in the suite, I sat at the desk and pulled out a thin leather-bound journal, one I hadn't touched in years. I wrote 3 sentences. He brought me to Paris once to impress me. I brought myself this time to remind him. We're not in the same city anymore. The next morning, my phone buzzed. A message from Colin. "Can we talk before we fly back? Just you and me." I didn't respond. Let him sit with it. Let him watch the woman he thought he'd left behind become someone he couldn't catch up to. This wasn't about leaving him behind anymore. It was about outgrowing the world he built for me, and building one that never needed him in the first place. The return flight was scheduled for 9:30 a.m. Monday morning. I'd requested Rhodes to push the crew call time back by 45 minutes. Not for mechanical reasons, not because I was delayed, but because I wanted Colin to sit in the cabin long enough to feel the absence of command. The jet was mine. The schedule was mine. The silence, also mine. I arrived precisely at 9:22. Colin was already seated, legs crossed, blazer folded neatly over the armrest beside him. No laptop, no phone, no performance. Just him, stripped of pretense, carrying the thin, crumbling edge of someone trying to recast himself mid-script. "Morning," he said, as I stepped aboard. I didn't respond immediately. I placed my bag in the forward stow, adjusted my scarf, and took the opposite seat, diagonal to his, but not facing him directly. Rhodes acknowledged me quietly as I entered, then returned to the cockpit. Only then did I speak. "I had my attorney send over the dissolution papers this morning." His jaw tightened, just for a second. "I assumed that's where this was headed," he said softly, though the jet reveal was dramatic. "Not dramatic," I said. "Documented." He gave a short breath, more exhale than laugh. "So that's it?" I reached into my portfolio and pulled out a simple 2-page printout. He accepted it with the caution of someone handling explosive material, which, in a way, it was. "This is a mutual release," I explained. "You walk away with everything you currently hold, minus the assets under Menon Legacy Trust, which are legally untouchable. I walk away with the same." He scanned it, brows tightening at the clause midway down. "Neither party shall pursue present or future claims upon the intellectual, financial, digital, or proprietary holdings of the other, whether disclosed or undisclosed at the time of dissolution." "You're serious," he murmured. I said nothing. "You don't want the house? Or the Nantucket property?" "No." "The art collection?" "You curated it. Keep it." He blinked. "Why?" I met his gaze squarely. "Because everything I've built is newer, stronger. Mine." He sat back slowly, the paper trembling faintly in his hands. "You want out clean. I want out free." For the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression. Not regret, not anger, not even guilt. It was confusion, as if he'd spent so long defining me by what I lacked, a title, an inheritance, a legacy name, that he couldn't comprehend that I had built a world without him, not to spite him, but simply because he didn't fit in it. Genevieve did not board the return flight. He said she'd taken a commercial flight back the night before. citing schedule conflicts. I didn't press. I didn't care. I had no interest in her shame, just as I had no interest in parading my victory. This wasn't about scoring points. This was about setting the final coordinates on an exit route I'd been mapping since the day he canceled Paris. Was any of it real? He asked as the engines roared to life beneath us. The question was small, human. It wasn't manipulative. It was vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen in years. I turned my head to the window. Yes, I said, but only the part I carried alone. He looked down at the papers again, then set them aside. Not torn, not contested, just placed carefully between us, a boundary in legal form. As we took off, I watched the city shrink beneath us, the cobbled streets, the old rooftops, the Seine glinting like ribbon in the sun. Paris wasn't a symbol anymore. It was a witness, to silence, to sovereignty, to the unraveling of a script I never wrote, and the beginning of one I authored alone. When we reached cruising altitude, I reclined my seat and closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to feel the weight of the sky and know for the first time in years that it belonged entirely to me. Altitude changes everything. From 41,000 feet, cities become suggestion. Roads vanish into veins. Skyscrapers shrink into breadcrumbs of ambition. There's no noise up here, just the muted hum of achievement and the whisper of pressurized inevitability. That's where I signed the final documents. Margaret had arranged it all. A secured digital transaction suite synced to my private flight terminal. As we crossed over the North Atlantic, she texted a single word. Ready. I didn't ask for more. While Colin scrolled through his inbox with the nervous posture of a man looking for bad news dressed as business, I opened my tablet and reviewed the transaction queue. It was all there. Final release clause. Equity transfer from Menon Aero's holding in Synthesis Sky to the new parent entity, Menon Strategic Flight Holdings. Acquisition term sheet from the Swedish firm, now upgraded to a 58.2 matter valuation based on revised demand forecasting and proprietary AI route compression. A new irrevocable trust with my mother's name on it, the Sarita Menon Legacy Fund. Initial funding, 4.2 matters. Purpose, aviation education for girls aged 12 to 18. I scrolled slowly. This wasn't just dissolution. It was ascension. I tapped to confirm the signatures. Biometric scan. 2-factor auth. All quiet. All clean. When it was done, I sat back and let the weight shift. Not physical, but existential. It was like stepping out of one body and into another. I hadn't just left a marriage. I'd stepped out of a persona, a version of myself that had been edited for appeal, polished for partnership, silenced for symmetry. Colin noticed the shift, even if he didn't know what I'd done. You're different, he said suddenly. You're quieter. No, I said without looking at him. You're just listening now. He closed his laptop. So, what happens next? I turned to face him. You'll go back to your firm. You'll tell them you've agreed to an amicable dissolution. You'll pretend this was your idea. You'll spin it as evolution, not loss. He didn't respond. And you'll sign the agreement. No edits. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. You want me to disappear? No, I said. I want you to learn what it feels like to be irrelevant. That landed, not with a thud, but with a soft, exacting chill. The kind of line that would echo later, long after he'd replayed this conversation in his head over drinks, over regrets, over stories he'd have to rewrite for credibility. The truth was, I didn't hate him. Hatred requires effort, attention, and he'd already taken too much of that. I simply didn't need him anymore. And when power is rooted in needlessness, it's unshakable. We landed back in Boston under cloudy skies, a symbolic symmetry, returning to the place where it had all started, now entirely redefined. The tarmac was wet with mist. The ground crew moved efficiently. There were no waiting photographers, no onlookers, no press, just me, my car, my departure. As I stepped off the aircraft, Rhodes met me at the stairs. Congratulations, he said under his breath. For what? He smiled. For being the only person I've ever flown who truly owned both the plane and the story. I tipped my head in thanks and climbed into the waiting black sedan. Colin didn't follow. He stayed behind, speaking with the crew, asking irrelevant questions, pretending to care about departure windows or fuel ratios, anything to ground himself in control. I didn't look back. Instead, I texted Margaret. Confirmed. Signed and filed. Tell them to wire the first tranche to Zurich. And dissolve the dummy Delaware entities. Keep Menon intact. Then I texted Ingrid, the Swedish CEO. We're airborne. I'll meet you in Oslo next week. Let's talk scale. And finally, I opened my private social app account, the one no one but my closest team knew, and posted a single photo, a shot of my fingers on the window ledge of the Gulf Stream. Clouds outside, light pouring in. The caption? Altitude isn't about height. It's about perspective. No hashtags, no tags, no name, just flight. Mine. The invitation arrived 3 days after we landed. A cream envelope, hand-delivered, no return address, just my name written in Colin's familiar, ambitious script. Inside, a single card embossed with the logo of Bellamy, the high-end restaurant where we'd once celebrated his second partnership promotion. He had reserved the private wine cellar. Friday at 7 p.m., I didn't reply. I simply showed up. Not for closure, but because I knew what he wanted, and more importantly, I knew what he feared. Bellamy hadn't changed. Still dark wood and glass walls, still filled with men who talked like they were whispering state secrets over Wagyu steak and $800 Bordeaux. The sommelier nodded at me with a flash of surprise, maybe even respect. I wasn't the woman they remembered. That woman had always followed someone else's lead. This one ordered a dry Riesling and requested a different chair, the one facing the room, not the wall. Colin arrived 2 minutes late, exactly as expected. Late enough to assert distance, but not enough to be rude. A performance, like always. He kissed the air near my cheek. You look incredible. I smiled. I always did. He flinched. The waiter appeared. Colin ordered for both of us without asking. I let him finish, then corrected the order gently. No meat, I said. I've shifted. His brow furrowed, then smoothed. He was calculating, rebuilding the mental profile of me that he could manipulate. He didn't know that software no longer worked on this operating system. The first course came. Silence stretched like silk between us. Then he leaned in. I've been thinking. Dangerous. He smiled tightly. I was wrong about a lot of things. About you. About how much space I took up. I sipped my wine. And I don't expect to undo it, he said. But I'd like to understand it. To at least name what I lost. I tilted my head. You want absolution? No, he said quickly. Just context. I paused. Let the weight of the moment build before delivering it. You lost a woman who spent 5 years making herself small enough to fit inside your version of a future. You mistook restraint for passivity, and you built a narrative where you were the visionary, and I was just support staff. That's not... It is, I said quietly. But don't worry. You weren't the first man to do it. You just happened to do it to the wrong woman. He exhaled slowly, gaze dropping to his fork. You were building something behind me the whole time. No, I corrected. I was building beyond you. Another silence. But this one was heavier. What do you want from me? He asked finally. Nothing, I said. And that's what scares you. Because men like Colin survive on leverage. They know how to handle rage, even tears. But nothing disarms them like calm indifference. The absence of desire. The absence of need. I stood before dessert. Left 2 crisp hundreds under my plate. Not for him. For the woman who'd refill the glasses and smile without being seen. As I slipped on my coat, he asked, was any of it enough? I turned, framed in the glow of the cellar door. No, I said, but it taught me how to build enough for myself. And then I walked out. Not into the night, not into the city, but into a life I no longer had to explain, hide or adjust for anyone else's comfort. He stayed behind, surrounded by wine he couldn't finish, and silence he couldn't control. And for the first time, I think he finally understood. I hadn't left him. I'd simply outgrown the space he mistook for a future. The Men & Arrow office wasn't in a traditional tower. It was built inside a repurposed control hangar on the outskirts of a decommissioned airfield, the kind of space most people overlook, where old prop planes used to gather dust and ghosts. But to me, it was the perfect symbol. A place once used to watch others take off, now reimagined to launch something of my own. We painted the walls bone white, installed thermal glass, natural light, and a central map lit by pinpricks of aircraft data. Our conference table was a recycled wing segment from a retired Dassault Falcon. The war room had a quiet hum to it, not from computers, but from clarity, from purpose. And most days now, I wasn't the only woman at the table. That was the point. There were 6 of us in the room that morning. Engineers, logistics strategists, airframe analysts, all women, all quiet storm systems in motion. At the head of the table was Amira, our new director of routing operations. She was 29, former Air Force, once dismissed from a defense contractor for being too intense. Now she managed 14 aircraft in 4 time zones. Across from her sat Imani, our youngest hire, barely 23, whose pitch for optimizing cabin retrofit costs had saved us $1, $2 million in Q2. She drank her coffee black and coded like it was poetry. When I walked in, the room didn't go silent. They didn't stand. They nodded, respectfully, but they kept talking. That was how I knew we were succeeding. Landing slot at Teterboro is tight, Amira said, pointing at a cluster of red on the route board. We'll need FAA to clear a cross-check on 7L. They'll push back. Tell them it's for a neonatal med evac flight, I said. It isn't. I know, I said, but it could have been. And they know better than to ask questions when they see our tail number. The room smiled, not cruelly, strategically. You don't survive in aviation by being polite. You survive by being precise. The meeting wrapped. I lingered, walking slowly through the back of the hangar, past the operations wall. Dozens of pinned photos of every captain, co-pilot, crew member, engineer, and partner who had flown for us, fixed for us, believed in us. Near the bottom corner, someone had taped a quote I hadn't seen before, handwritten, ink slightly smudged. She stopped asking for permission and started asking for payload range. I didn't know who had written it, but I knew exactly what it meant. Colin used to tell me I was obsessed with metaphors, that I read too much poetry into machines. But to me, the aircraft had always spoken in symbols. Altitude wasn't just flight, it was autonomy. Velocity wasn't just speed, it was strategy. Now, I watched these women navigate data sets and wind shear like they were composing music, and I realized I'd built something better than a company. I'd built a signal, a way of telling the world, you don't have to wait to be lifted. You can build your own altitude. That evening, I was invited to speak at an aerospace panel downtown. The venue was one of those sterile, modern spaces, lined with navy carpets and soft lighting designed to simulate gravitas. My name tag read, Dr. Marin Menon, CEO, Menon Aero Holdings. The moderator, a man from a major airline group, introduced me last. His voice lingered on my credentials a beat too long. I could tell he hadn't expected me to be me. I smiled and adjusted the mic. I'm not here to talk about planes, I said. I'm here to talk about thresholds. A pause. The first time someone told me I couldn't own a jet, it wasn't about money. It was about myth, about who gets to sit where, about who the sky belongs to. But the truth is, the sky doesn't belong to anyone. It's open airspace. The only question is whether you've filed your flight plan. A few in the audience smiled. A few didn't know what to do with me. That was fine. I wasn't speaking to them. I was speaking to the girl in the third row with an aviation patch on her backpack and her hand still halfway raised. After the panel, that same girl found me backstage. You're real, she whispered. I nodded. So are you. She handed me a notebook. Inside were sketches of aircraft systems, journal entries, dream routes across Asia, ideas for sustainable fuel cells. I handed her my card. Come fly with us. As I walked back to the car, I checked my phone. A message from Colin. Just 4 words. You were always right. I didn't reply. I simply stared at the screen for a moment, then powered off the phone. Because some endings don't need applause. They just need altitude. There is no moment when you officially arrive. Not in the cinematic sense, anyway. No trumpets. No press conference. No blinding light pouring through the windows to anoint you queen of your own becoming. Arrival is quieter than that. A click in your chest. A stillness you didn't know you were chasing. A day where you don't have to prove anything, because you no longer owe anyone an explanation for your presence. It happened for me in the cockpit of a simulator. I was alone. No pilot, no co-pilot. Just me and the soft glow of a dozen digital indicators. It was part of a new certification I'd decided to pursue, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel every layer of the thing I had built, from the rivets to the lift-to-drag ratio, from cold start to descent. I pushed the throttle forward and let the simulated Gulf Stream respond, the screen ahead showing a pale blue sky melting into ocean. For a moment, I wasn't CEO or ex-wife or strategist or even survivor. I was just a woman in the sky, where no one could overwrite her story. The last email I ever received from Colin arrived a week later. Final signature submitted. I hope you find what you were looking for. C. I archived it without reply. He would never know that I'd already found it. Not in Paris. Not in the jet. Not even in the millions now routing into clean, layered investments from Oslo to Singapore. But in a single moment 3 nights ago, standing at the threshold of my mother's old storage unit in Atlanta. I'd flown commercial, under my maiden name. No assistance, no agenda, just me, tracing back a ghost line. Inside, beneath boxes of photo albums and receipts from long-gone laundromats, I found what I didn't know I'd been looking for. A manila folder marked Lorraine Flight Logs. My mother's logs. Dated, scribbled, tear-stained in some places, but still intact. Every takeoff, every landing, every deviation, every engine complaint, every moment of trust between her and the sky. She'd never owned a plane. She could barely afford the gas for her lessons, but she had tracked her flight hours with the precision of a woman who knew history wouldn't record her, so she recorded herself. I spent 2 hours cross-referencing her logbook with FAA archives, and when I found her final flight entry, December 2nd, 1987, from Birmingham to Savannah, I cross-checked the aircraft. It still existed, retired, grounded, forgotten. I bought it on the spot, not for flight, for restoration. I would name it Lorraine Ward. A museum had already agreed to host it in their permanent exhibition, next to a plaque that would read, "In honor of those who were told the sky wasn't theirs, and flew anyway." The press would love it, of course, but this wasn't for them. It was for the 17-year-old girl in me who used to sit in a borrowed hoodie on the edge of the tarmac, sketching wing structures while pretending not to care when boys mocked her for it. It was for the woman I became the moment Colin called me a hobbyist in front of those men at the gala. It was for every woman who ever filed her dreams under too much or not yet or maybe later. I returned to Boston the next day, stepped into my hangar, and stood beneath the tail fin of Men & Arrow's flagship jet, the one that had carried my past to Paris, and returned with only my future. Rhodes approached quietly. "New route request came in," he said. "Where to?" "Anywhere," he said. "It just says, pilot's choice." I smiled. "No," I said. "Not pilot's choice." He raised a brow. "It's mine now." He smiled back, nodded, and walked off to prep the flight. I stayed there a while longer, watching the sun shift over the wing's edge, gold bleeding into silver, shadow trailing into flight. This was what freedom looks like. Not loud, not dramatic, just airborne. And this time, for the first time, the sky was signing my name.